So here we are at the base of the sacred rock of the Acropolis. The area today consists of about 70,000 square meters of archaeological remains. But its crowning glory, of course, is the Temple of the Parthenon, which is our final destination this morning. The whole area is surrounded by a pedestrian street which unifies the archaeological sites around the whole city. So in essence, you can go from one site to the other without even crossing a street. We start our climb up the western slope, which is the only accessible slope since antiquity. The Acropolis had to be inaccessible on three sides because it functioned from Athens' earliest history as a fortress, among other things. We'll talk about the other functions of the Acropolis and the temples once we get up there. We'll take the route that more or less would have been taken by ancient Athenians. The route that the Panathenaic festival that took place every year, walking up the side of the western slope, would have followed as well. So the first thing that we see as we commence our walk up is the impressive Roman Odeon of Herod Atticus. It was built in the 2nd century when Greece was part of the Roman Empire, and it was built by a Greek man whose name was Herod Atticus. He gave his name to the Odeon to honor his Roman wife, Regilla. It originally had a 3-storied arched stone front, marble front, and a wooden roof of expensive Lebanese cedar. It was used, and it still is used as a music venue. The capacity is about 5,000 people. In the 1950s, it was restored and used as one of the main venues for the Athens Festival, which takes place every year from May to about September. It's hosted eminent artists, including Pavarotti and so on. We continue up the slope and we make our way to the area under the gorgeous Ionic Temple of Athena Nike. It's considerably smaller than the other temples atop the Acropolis, and this temple was built entirely of Pendelic marble, just like the other temples on top of the Acropolis, in the late 5th century BC. It was dedicated to the goddess of victory, and the temple used to house a wooden statue of Nike. But Nike usually is depicted with wings. The one here, though, had no wings, so it was the wingless victory. And legend has it that the Athenians wanted to keep victory in Athens, and so they made her wingless as a result. It was easily accessible to all Athenians at any time, who would especially come to leave offerings to the goddess in times of war, in the hopes of a prosperous outcome, of course. As with the other temples, this one was decorated with beautiful friezes depicting the victory of the Greek alliance of city-states over the Persians, among other subject matters. And this was to remind the Athenians of their past glories and to raise morale in times of siege. We'll now carry on up and through the official entry of the Acropolis, called the Propylaea. This was the magnificent entrance hall brilliantly designed by Mnesicles, whose structure overcame the problem posed by the different levels and steepness of the western slope. We'll walk through the central hall, which is flanked on both sides by Doric columns that you can see today. The ceiling, which is no longer intact, was supported by Ionic columns and was painted with gold stars on a dark blue background. As we walk through, on our left side was part of the structure used as a banqueting hall initially, and later as a gallery for paintings and frescoes, kind of like an early art gallery of sorts. The right side is smaller because of the presence of the Temple of Nike and was most likely built purely to create a sense of symmetry. This was one of the important things for the ancient Greek architects. At the end of the corridor we walk along, there are 5 doors. The largest of them was used during the Panathenaic procession held every summer to honor the goddess Athena, and which was the most important festival of the Athenian ritual year. Upon exiting the Propylaea, we'll have our first glimpse of the Parthenon, standing slightly to our right and dominating the sacred hill. In ancient times, however, the first thing visitors would have seen in front of them wouldn't have been the Parthenon, but the almost 30-foot tall bronze statue of Athena Promachus. It was created by the genius sculptor Phidias, who we'll talk about a little bit later. And this colossal statue could have been seen gleaming under the Athenian sky by sailors up to 45 miles away. Unfortunately, the statue was taken to Constantinople some 1,500 years ago and subsequently destroyed in a fire. So we're standing here after the Propylaea, and in front of us we've got the Parthenon to our right, the Erechtheion to our left, and the whole hill of the Acropolis laid out in front of us. So you've made it up the hill. You're standing here in front of the iconic Parthenon, the structure that was dedicated to Athena Parthena, or the Virgin Athena, who was the protector and the patroness of the city of Athens. And of course, she gave her name to the city. Built in the 5th century BC, its architects were Ictinus and Callicrates, and its decoration, the friezes, the pediments, the metopes, etc., were carried out under the sculptor Phidias. The Parthenon itself took 9 years to build, and then a further 6 years to complete the decoration. And to this day, it's regarded as an enduring symbol not only of ancient Greece and Athenian democracy and the accomplishments of that Athenian golden age of the 5th century BC, but it's a symbol of Western civilization in general. It's one of the world's greatest cultural monuments today, but to the Athenians who built it, the Parthenon and the other monuments atop the Acropolis were first and foremost a celebration of the victories of the Greek alliance of city-states, led by the Athenians, of course, over the Persian invaders, and a way of thanking their gods for those victories. What is it, though, about the Parthenon that has made every visitor from the 5th century BC until today stand in awe of it? It's not antiquity's largest temple. In fact, the Temple of Zeus right here in Athens was larger. It's not the first or the last Doric temple ever built. Yes, it was built in pristine Pedelic marble, quarried and carted over 15 miles to the hill of the Acropolis from Mount Pendeli. It's impressive, but it's not the only time tons of marble were carried great distances in antiquity. But what makes this 5th century BC temple that was built on the site of an earlier temple of Athena so unique? The answer lies in what are called its optical refinements. You see, the Parthenon is a structure whose perfection lies in the fact that it is actually imperfect. There are in essence no straight lines, either horizontal or vertical, and it is this imperfection which makes it, in fact, look perfect. Let's try to understand this. Ancient architectural principles in the 5th century BC Golden Age of Athens went hand in hand with the golden principles of geometry, mathematics as an art form of sorts. Every single element of the construction of the Acropolis, from the building's placements atop the hill to their orientation to the number of columns on each side, was based on mathematical principles. Yet these ancient genius architects knew that our eyes can deceive us depending on where we stand when viewing something. So when constructing the Parthenon, they deliberately departed from precision and employed these almost imperceptible yet crucial optical refinements to make the structure appear symmetrical. Take the columns, for example. There are 8 Doric columns on each short side and 17 on each long side, a very specific golden ratio based on the square root of 5, something that captivated the Greeks. The columns look straight, don't they? But they're not. They bulge outwards about a third of the way up. This is called entasis. Architects Ictinus and Callicrates knew that when you have a series of large, straight, vertical lines, your eye tricks you into thinking that they bow inwards, towards the middle. So to make up for that, they bulged them slightly outwards. Voila, your eyes think the columns are straight now. If you look very, very carefully, you'll notice that the columns are not placed equidistantly, much for the same reason. The corner columns are thicker than the internal ones to counteract another visual distortion, namely that they would appear thinner than the inner columns because light on both sides sort of shaves off inches. Think about the effect when you look at something with the sun behind it. It looks thinner than it actually is. The columns also all lean in slightly to counteract the fact that from a distance, straight lines appear to fall outward. To avoid a sagging effect, the base underneath the column is approximately 6 centimeters higher at its center than at the corners. And you can only really see that if you were to be able to go up to the corner and look at an object placed on the opposite corner. You wouldn't be able to see it because of the fact that the base is higher in the center. There are other such refinements that required an immense degree of understanding of both geometric principles and the subtlety of human visual perception, and that contributed to the creation of a building of sublime, imperfect perfection. The Parthenon and all the buildings atop the Acropolis would have looked vastly different in ancient times to what they look like today. The reason for that is that all of them were most probably painted in very colorful hues. We know that the ancient Greeks and the Romans after them liked painting their temples and their statues and so on. Not the columns themselves, but the decorative elements on the top, the capitals, the friezes, and the pediments. The Parthenon functioned mainly as the house of the magnificent cult statue of Athena Parthenos. Athena Parthenos was obviously the goddess Athena, and the word Parthenos means the virgin goddess, so it was the palace of the virgin. It was a statue created by Phidias in gold and ivory. Her flesh was ivory, everything else was gold. It was a symbol of the city of Athens for over 1,000 years. Unfortunately, it was lost, possibly taken to Constantinople. Nobody really knows what happened to the statue after that. But that was the main purpose of the temple. Temples in ancient times were dedicated to a specific god or goddess in the pantheon and used as a house for the cult statue, and then also as a storeroom or a storehouse for votive offerings. Here, the Parthenon was also used as a treasury for the riches of the Athenian League, so something like a bank or like a Fort Knox of its day. Another thing I'd like to mention is that temples in ancient Greece were very different from our places of worship today. The public, of course, were encouraged to participate insofar as making offerings and dedications, but otherwise their participation was limited to taking part in religious festivals. You couldn't just walk up and go inside a temple like the Parthenon. The altar, in fact, wasn't even inside the temple. Altars were always outside, and this is where sacrifices were made. So the main function of the temple was to house the statue of the god or goddess to whom it was dedicated. Now we're going to walk around to the north side of the Parthenon to see the last structure that was built on the Acropolis in the late 5th century BC, and that was the Erechtheion. The name derives from an older shrine dedicated to a legendary Greek king hero, Erechtheus. It's an elegant Ionic structure, and it was built possibly by Mnesicles, the same architect who built the Propylaea, the entrance gate that we walked through earlier, with the sculptor Phidias, of course, doing the decorative elements. Phidias was employed by Pericles. Pericles was the influential general of Athens during its golden age. The temple was built over a temple dedicated to Athena Polias, or the protector of the city of Athens, that had been destroyed by the Persians in 480 BC. Pericles wanted to preserve multiple adjacent sacred sites in one building, and this fact accounts for the building's complex design. The entire temple is built on a slope, which its asymmetrical design is because of this, and it's entirely of Pendelic marble, just like all of the other buildings atop the Acropolis. The Erechtheion is associated with sort of an eclectic assortment of the most ancient and sacred relics of the Athenians, the most important being the simple ancient olive wood statue of Athena Polias, which was the endpoint for that annual Panathenaic festival procession that I mentioned earlier. It was the statue that was draped with the peplos, or dress, that was carried to the sacred location by Athenian maidens. The building is an interesting kind of contrast or juxtaposition to the Parthenon just opposite it, because it's such an elegant and highly decorative building housing a very simple ancient olive wood statue, whereas the Parthenon is a severe Doric temple, very sort of serious style, with this very ornate statue of Athena inside. The building also sits on the site of the legendary contest between Athena and Poseidon, in which the winner would become the protector of the city. In the contest, Poseidon, they say, struck a rock at the site with his trident, and seawater gushed forth. This symbolized naval power because Poseidon was the god of the sea. Athena, for her part, offered an olive tree, which bloomed next to the Erechtheion, and this, of course, symbolized peace and fertility and prosperity. The Athenians chose her offering, and as a result, she became the protector and the patron of the city to which she gave her name. Finally, the Erechtheion is also the location of the supposed burial places of Cecrops, who was the mythical founder of the city of Athens, and Erechtheus, another mythical god king of the city, as well as housing an area dedicated to Zeus. So a really eclectic assortment of different shrines all in one. But the most elegant part of the structure is the Porch of the Maidens, or the Caryatids. These are the 6 statues that serve as columns on the porch on the south side of the building. They're all copies. 5 of the originals are in the Acropolis Museum, and 1 is in the British Museum in London. We will talk about how a lot of the Parthenon and the Acropolis marbles ended up in the British Museum in London in another installment that has to do with sort of the destructions and the different things that happened to the Acropolis over the ages. Now that we've finished with the structures on top of the Acropolis, I want you to focus your gaze on the city of Athens and the region of Attica all around you. From the south slope, if you look down, you'll see the Acropolis Museum, you'll see the theater of Dionysus, and the temple of Zeus in the distance. The Theater of Dionysus, which is right on the southern slopes of the Acropolis, was built initially in the 6th century BC, in the late 6th century BC, and reconstructed many times throughout its history. It's the first theater in the world. It was dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, whose festivals were the driving force behind the development of Greek theater. And this venue was used for theatrical performances of the great tragic poets, including Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles. You can walk through that if you'd like later on. If you turn your gaze towards the east and a bit north, you'll see the highest point in Athens, which is Mount Lycabettus. It's close to about 900 feet above sea level. It's the spot that should have been the Acropolis, but it couldn't be in Athens because of its shape and also because of the fact that there's no potable water source on top of Lycabettus. And so in times of siege, of course, you need a source of water. The hill of the Acropolis in fact has that source of water. So that was the other reason why it was chosen. That was the spot that was chosen for the buildings atop the Acropolis. Lycabettus today has a 19th century church dedicated to St. George at the top, a nice restaurant, and you can access it either by walking, it's quite a steep walk up, or by a funicular that runs on a regular schedule. You can also look right below where that flag is. If you go up, there's a viewpoint there. If you look straight down, you'll see the oldest area of Athens called the Plaka. It's in the shadow of the Acropolis, full of narrow cobblestone streets that are lined with shops selling jewelry and clothes, ceramics, statues, sandals, anything you can imagine. Sidewalk cafes and restaurants are interspersed with archaeological remains, and it's an interesting place to just get lost in your free time. And finally, if you look down the north slope of the Acropolis, you'll see a large green area interspersed with different archaeological remains. That's the heart of the ancient city. It's the ancient Agora. And one of the best preserved ancient Doric temples is in that area. You can clearly see it. It's the temple dedicated to Hephaestus, and it's just it almost looks like a small copy of the Parthenon. It's well worth visiting the Agora just to see that and to see the reconstructed stoa of Attalus, which is down in the Agora as well. Enjoy your time up here on the hill of the Acropolis. Take it all in, and I will see you for the next installment of our virtual tour.